themselves. So I'm just going to do all the introductions in the beginning. So our first speaker will be Dr. Susan Weiss. She is the director of the Division of Extramural Research at NIDA, and which oversees NIDA's extramural programs, operations planning, and trans NIH initiatives such as the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development, ABCD, and Healthy Brain and Child Development, HBCD studies. She also serves as a senior science advisor to the NIDA director and scientific liaison to NIH, HHS, and other federal agencies. Previously, she served as the chief of the science policy branch and acting director of NIDA's Office of Science Policy and Communications. So Dr. Ziva Cooper is the director of the UCLA Center for Cannabis and Cannabinoids in the Jane and Terry Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior and professor in the UCLA Departments of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences and Anesthesiology. Her research involves understanding variables that influence both the therapeutic potential and adverse effects of cannabis and cannabinoids. She received her PhD from the University of Michigan in biopsychology in the field of preclinical psychopharm, and then trained at Columbia University in human behavioral pharmacology. So she has served on the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine Committee on the Health Effects of Cannabis that published a comprehensive report of the health effects of cannabis and cannabinoids in 2017. And she's also serving on the NASEM Committee on the Public Health Consequences of Changes in the Cannabis Policy Landscape. So Dr. Margaret or Meg Haney is a professor of neurobiology and psychiatry at the Columbia University Irving Medical Center. She is the director of the Cannabis Research Laboratory and co-director of the Substance Use Research Center. She is internationally recognized for her expertise in cannabis and cannabinoids. She conducts placebo-controlled studies testing the potential treatment medications for cannabis use disorder and the potential therapeutic effects of cannabis and its constituents. Her research has been continuously supported by the National Institute of Health since 1999, and she has authored over 160 articles and peer-reviewed journals. So she's very well known and respected for her work. And last but not least, we have Jeff Laredo with us today. He'll be serving as the discussant of our seminar. He's a nationally recognized expert in addiction policy and the full range of associated public health and public policy issues. He retired from federal civil service in 2018 and is currently principal at Santa Cruz Strategies, LLC. His federal career spanned 30 years in several different agencies and roles. Most recently, he was a senior advisor of the Office of Science Policy and Communications at NIDA. He was a key advisor to the NIDA director and other institute staff members. So he previously worked at NIAAA. So we're really, really happy to have Jeff here today as well, because he will lead the discussion on this topic. So without further ado, Dr. Weiss, would you like to start your presentation?
Yes. So thank you very much for having us here today. As you see, we will be going back and forth a bit between us, but I'm going to sort of start out trying to lay a little bit of the groundwork. So I think, as most of us know, we have a discrepancy between U.S. federal policy and the state policies. Under federal law, cannabis is a Schedule I substance. It's illegal, and it is defined as marijuana, which is cannabis with a greater than 0.3% delta-9 THC content dry weight. It's considered to have a high potential for abuse and no currently accepted medical use. Under the Agriculture Improvement Act, which is also known as the Farm Bill of 2018, hemp was removed from the definition of cannabis and from the controlled status, and hemp was defined as having less than 0.3% delta-9 THC dry weight. So it's no longer a controlled substance. The Farm Bill preserved FDA's authority to regulate products under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, and this also doesn't affect the control of synthetically derived tetrahydrocannabinols. And you'll be hearing a bit more about this, particularly from Ziva, because we know that that many of the results of the Farm Bill have led to the proliferation of products with either unknown or potentially harmful health effects. At this time, there are 38 states and DC that have broad medical marijuana laws. There may be a 39th. Nebraska passed it in November, but it's under it's being contested in the courts at this point. And there are 24 states and DC that have adult use laws. And the states have very different approaches to this. All of them have some sorts of testing and regulation, but they have differences in terms of the medical marijuana laws, in terms of the allowable conditions and routes of administration, whether there are dispensaries or home growth allowed. Some of the states require patient registries. And with the adult use laws, there are also differences on product marketing, labeling, where it can be distributed, where it can be consumed, taxation, licensing, and expungement and equity, which are a very big part of many of the adult use laws in the states. Next slide, please. So it's always very complex when we're talking about cannabis. And to begin with, we often don't even use the same words to mean the same things. And so the term medical marijuana has many different meanings to people. Some people are talking about cannabis products that are mostly THC. Some are talking about products that are mostly CBD. And we tend to conflate all of these things, which makes, sorry, the discussions even more difficult. It's a plant. It contains more than 120 different cannabinoids, and there are other constituents that may or may not contribute to some of the effects of the plant. There are two key cannabinoids that have been the major ones that have been studied, CBD and delta-9 THC, but there are many others, and they are under study right now. There are many different ways of using cannabis, even though smoking remains the predominant method. There are now vaping products. There are these highly concentrated products that can be dabbed. There are oral preparations, topical preparations, and many of these methods have unknown potential health effects, either good or bad. And then there are these emerging compounds, which, as I said, you'll hear more about from Ziva in a couple of minutes, but many of these are being derived from the hemp products that are no longer controlled. And delta-8 THC is one of the ones that falls into that category, which is also intoxicating, and which something like 11 or 12% of high school seniors reported using in last year's Monitoring the Future survey. So they're becoming quite popular and quite available. And then because of all of this regulatory complexity, it makes it very difficult for researchers to figure out what exactly they need to do the research. You know, products can be derived from hemp or non-hemp derived, even though they're the same chemical. They can be synthetic or naturally derived, and they will have different control status. Next slide, please. So it's federally illegal. Each state has different laws and different products. There's no one unifying body regulating the production or sales of cannabis in the states, and it's a very rapidly growing industry. Next slide. And as I said, the products have been changing. What you can see on the right-hand side of this are results from a potency monitoring project that NIDA has been supporting for many years. It's based on DEA samples. So these are samples that they are getting from the illegal market. So this does not include samples from the dispensaries and from the state legal markets, which actually have much higher levels of THC, somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 30%. But you can see that the amount of THC has been going up quite dramatically, even since the mid-90s, and before that it was even lower, while the CBD content has been relatively low and has fluctuated a little bit, but the ratio of THC to CBD in most of these products is now quite high. Wait, can you go back 1 second? One other point I wanted to make was just that we also have a lot of difficulty in measuring exposure because we know the fact that the states have different products and different ways of testing them, but population studies in particular have a difficult time measuring this because there are not really good, reliable measures of THC exposure, and consumers are often not sure exactly what they're getting. Next slide, please. And I'm turning it over to Ziva.
Thank you. So if you look at the legal market, we kind of see a different picture being painted here. And so these are products from Washington State, which has medical and non-medical legal markets. And you can see that the strength of cannabis flower, as measured by percent THC, um, on average is about 20% THC, but it goes up to 35%. Also in this market in Washington State, there are those dabs, wax, and extracts, and you can see that THC percent is going all the way up to almost 100% THC concentration. So the products that people are using in these regulated markets are really strong, not necessarily captured by the figures that we see a lot from the seized cannabis that is measured by El Soli. So next, please. And so while one might think that the regulated market might provide safer products for consumers, what we're finding is that even in regulated markets with very stringent testing requirements, like in California, there have been stories about how these regulated products are really not the safest and they're not labeled accurately. And so this was an article that came out just in June 2024. And when I moved to California, I was impressed by the regulations that they put forth to monitor the safety and acceptability of the cannabis products. But this kind of expose demonstrated that the legal market is actually kind of gross. And so if you go to the next slide, you can see some quotes from legal producers who talk about their product was tested by journalists and it was talked about in this article. And essentially, they're saying that they are totally compliant with the laws, but yet when the products were analyzed, they had extremely high levels of pesticides and other toxic chemicals. And what they're saying here is that essentially, the regulations haven't been changed since 2018 when the laws were set forth of how to regulate these products. And since then, new products have emerged. So vape pens, for example, have become more popular. And different types of pesticides have emerged that are being used now that aren't listed as ones that are particularly banned. And so my question is always, well, okay, so there are high levels of pesticides. How quote unquote bad are they? And so this article gave a nice description of like how we should really be concerned about the levels of pesticides and adulterants in these types of products, especially if we're thinking about people who are using these products for medical purposes, who might have immune system deficiencies and other issues. They might be exposed to chemicals that aren't great. So if you go to the next slide, this continues to show, how high the levels of this particular pesticide was, and how concerning it is that even in a state like California that has rigorous testing laws, there isn't necessarily oversight, and the state doesn't necessarily even have guidance. There's no federal guidance here that can, tell the state how to set forth the most stringent criteria to make sure that these products are safe for consumers. And so if you go to the next slide, what we're finding here, and Susan mentioned this, is because of the Farm Bill loopholes where hemp is now legal and tetrahydrocannabinol, except for Delta 9 THC, are considered to be legal according to the Farm Bill. What we're seeing is that producers are taking hemp, again, legal hemp, and they're taking CBD and other chemicals from the hemp plant that are in high concentrations, and they're synthesizing potentially psychoactive cannabinoids that might actually be present in the plant at very low concentrations or not present in the plant at all, but they're able to synthesize these compounds from the hemp plant. And so we have a emerging market of these types of products, again, some of which have never been tested in animals, much less humans. And so this is an example of a vape pen that has delta 8 THC and THCP, two popular semi-synthetic cannabinoids that are derived from the hemp plant that are popping up in these vape pens. And from our experience, and I don't have data to show you, but people generally don't necessarily know that they're actually using these types of products. They go into a store and they get their vape pen, and they're not aware that there are these types of cannabinoids in their vape pen. On the other hand, some people think that they're using these products and they're exposing themselves to delta 8 and THCP and HHC and THCO acetate. But in fact, the actual product doesn't necessarily contain those cannabinoids. And so sometimes you'll see case reports about people that have been exposed to high levels of delta 8 THC or THCP. But the issue is that those case reports are really relying on what the participant or what the patient is reporting having used. It doesn't necessarily rely on what's in the actual product. So at this point, we know very little about these types of products. We know the most about delta 8 THC because there have been randomized controlled trials of delta 8 THC back in the 70s and the 80s. But other than that, we actually know very little about these types of emerging products. And so if you go to the next slide, what we're seeing is that this is a map of the United States. Can you hear me okay? Just making sure I'm not bleeding through.
Yep.
And what you can see here are rates of poison control calls related to delta 8 THC exposure. And Susan, did you show a map in the beginning? I forget. If you compare, okay. So if you look at, the map of the legal states versus the non-legal states, you'll see here that the states that are in the highest blue are states that don't have legal cannabis markets. And so what we're starting to see, there was a paper in the high schoolers, I think it was 8th, 10th, and 12th graders last year, where the prevalence of delta 8 use, delta 8 THC use is higher in states that do not have legal cannabis markets. And we're seeing the same thing with poison control calls. Okay, next slide. And
Okay.
Susan, take it over.
So in addition to the increases in potency and the different routes of administration and now the different products, we're also seeing drastic changes in the patterns of use in the United States. And this is a slide from Jonathan Calkins, and I've heard him talking about this now for some time, but he's looked at using data from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. He's looked at the prevalence of daily and non-daily use. And again, even this is not as finely, it's not as granular as we might want to see, because daily use can still be once a day before going to sleep, or daily use can be all day. But what you could see is that the number of people that have gone to daily use has gone up dramatically over the last few years. And what you can see on the right side is that it's actually finally exceeded the number of people who are using alcohol on a daily basis. So what we're seeing is not only higher potency products, different products, products with some unknown constituents and potentially pesticides, et cetera, but we're also seeing people using it quite a lot more. And this is, again, not the full picture, and we still don't know exactly how much THC they're being exposed to. Next slide, please. So this slide just gives you a sense of what types of products people are using, and there has been a shift in the types of products. This is from the International Cannabis Policy Survey that David Hammond leads, and what he's finding in the U.S. is that there is a slight decrease in the amount of use of dried flower, although that's still the preferred method of still the preferred product. There are increases in the amounts of edibles that people are using. Vape oils are stable, and the concentrates, which is that line in green, are also going up. So we're really starting to see these very diverse patterns, and especially among people who are daily users or who use quite a bit, they're usually using more than one product. And at the same time, we know that the price of THC has been decreasing, which we know that price can affect consumer behaviors. Next slide, please. So this is a slide from Monitoring the Future. This is a survey that NIDA has been supporting since 1975. And this just shows you the data from 12th graders from 1991 to 2023. And what you can see is, we were very worried about increasing use among teenagers. And we're not really seeing increases in 12th graders, but relative to alcohol and cigarettes, which have been going down quite dramatically over the years, marijuana use has been pretty stable. And it's stable with about 6.5% reporting daily or near daily use in 2023. And I would point out that this is a study that's done in the schools. And we do know that high rates of use among young people is associated with greater rates of school dropouts. So the numbers may be even higher for that particular age range. But even so, 6.5% with daily use has got to be affecting their ability to perform and to learn in school. Next slide, please. So again, we have many different reasons why cannabis is complex. We now know that there's increased access, there's increases in use of cannabis, but there's also a lot of interest in it because of the public health urgency and also because of the potential useful effects of cannabis or the cannabinoids. And research remains quite challenging, and you can hear a lot more about that from Ziva and Meg if you want more detail. I want to take, next slide, please. I want to just take a small divergence into just to explaining a little bit about how cannabis works in the brain and in the body, because I think it's important just to have some kind of rudimentary understanding of this, because it can help you understand why it could have such diverse effects on so many different systems. What you can see on the right side is sort of where the most dense areas of cannabinoid receptors are found in the human brain, and you can see that there are many different types of functions that are affected by those particular areas of the brain. I like the little picture on the left-hand side, though. That was actually the first demonstration of cannabinoid receptors in the rat brain. It's a sagittal slice, so it's a slice through the sideways on the brain. But what you can see is the red and yellow indicate the most dense cannabinoid areas of cannabinoid receptors, and they're basically in the cortex in the rat, as well as in the hippocampus and in the cerebellum, with much less in the brainstem. And that may be why cannabis doesn't have the same sort of respiratory effects that opioids have. But the cannabinoid receptors are among the most ubiquitous throughout the brain, and they're also in the body. And they tend to come in two types. There are others as well, but the main two types are CB1 and CB2. CB1 is on nerve cells and CB2 is on immune cells. And I'll tell you just a little bit more about how the endocannabinoid system works on the next slide. So this is another cartoon, but this is a cartoon basically showing you the way nerve cells interact with each other and how the endocannabinoids become involved in this. This whole signaling system was discovered by researchers who were interested in understanding how marijuana or cannabis produced the psychoactive effects that it did. And this entire system was revealed, which has, again, very important role throughout the brain. So what you can see, there are these endogenous cannabinoids. Two of them are known as anandamide and 2-AG or 2-arachidonyl glycerol. And these are very important for maintaining homeostasis among different signaling pathways. And what you can see on the left-hand side is the presynaptic nerve, which is the signaling nerve. It's the one that's communicating with the postsynaptic nerve. When it is stimulated and it releases chemicals called neurotransmitters, they bind to receptors, and a series of intracellular events follows, including the formation of endocannabinoids from the lipid precursors that are found in the membrane. So these endocannabinoids are actually made on demand, and they travel back to the presynaptic neuron where they dampen further excitation. So they have a very specific and well-controlled role, and they affect the signal functioning of these particular neurons. When you are using cannabis or another or a similar type of substance, the THC will bind to all of the cannabinoid receptors. So this happens in a supraphysiological way, a non-physiological way, and it's as opposed to the regulated way that the system normally functions. And as you do this repeatedly, the system itself starts to downregulate or starts to adapt to this overstimulation. So what you're doing is you're changing the way your endogenous system works. Some of these changes may be reversible when somebody stops using THC, but again, you're tapping into a system that has many different purposes, but you're tapping into it in a way that is not physiological, that's not regulated the way the system is intended. And these receptors are found, by the way, throughout the body as well as in the brain, even though that was what I showed you. Next slide, please. Okay, am I switching? Or
Um, yeah. Oops.
okay,
Yeah.
wait.
I think
Okay.
I can jump in now, and I just wanted to bring this slide back, although it's already been shown, because this, if you look at that green line to the right with daily or near daily users and that steady increase, that's of particular interest to me. I've been studying cannabis use disorder for a long time, and I wanted to talk about it here because in my dealings with the public, there's very little awareness, it seems to me, for the most part. It's not a point of discussion very much. So I did want to bring this up in this context here, is talk a little bit about cannabis use disorder. So in the United States, about 5.8% of the population is thought to meet criteria for cannabis use disorder. For the most part, it's mild cannabis use disorder, and this is just the DSM criteria. So mild could just be, craving or tolerance, but it's the moderate to severe cannabis use disorder that I think has important implications. Cannabis use disorder is qualitatively similar to other substance use disorders. There's withdrawal, it's disruptive, it's persistent. Remission rates are low for people who are trying to quit cannabis. Their success rate is as low as many other drugs of abuse. In the United States, people seeking treatment, 10% report cannabis as their primary substance. Again, something's very surprising to most of the public. The reasons for seeking treatment for cannabis use disorder might be more subtle than other substance use disorders, but it's significant to the individual. So they're failing to fulfill work or personal obligations, low productivity, memory issues, low energy, continuing to use despite persistent personal or financial problems. And again, experience this unsuccessful effort to cut down. And, the clinicians I work with who treat people with cannabis use disorder. It's one of the things most distressing to the patients is, not a lot of people think this cannabis is going to cause them many problems, and they're very kind of frustrated with themselves at how hard it is for them to rein it in. So although the consequences of cannabis use disorder are not as severe as opioids, certainly, or stimulants or alcohol, it's significantly distressing to the individual. So, we've touched upon the factors that could impact the development of cannabis use disorder. Certainly age of onset, teenagers they're more vulnerable to all substance use disorders, including cannabis. Certainly the frequency in which you use per week, the amount you use per day, and the route of administration. Tobacco use is a poor predictor. Typically people who smoke tobacco and use cannabis fare worse in their ability to rein in their cannabis use. So we've talked about these other methods, delivery methods, and they're certainly going to play a role in the likelihood of developing cannabis use disorder because these concentrate products are so high. So I have a bit of an unusual interpretation of the more potent flower, which, most certainly has been increasing as we see in potency. To date, I have not seen the potency of the flower is not the dose. So although the potency has gone up considerably, when I see data on plasma THC levels with individuals using this very potent flower, the plasma levels of THC are very similar to those I see in the lab with much less potent nita cannabis. So the thing about cannabis is individuals titrate when they're smoking the flower. You can't titrate so well when you're using a concentrate product, but when people are smoking the flower, if it's less potent, they tend to smoke a lot more, and if it's more potent, they smoke less. Now, of course, we still need to know if this exposure to this higher potency flower ultimately leads to a greater likelihood of cannabis use disorder, but we're not certain about that yet. So, the other distressing thing about cannabis is that we know the effects of advertising and marketing on use. We know that for tobacco and alcohol. And as a country, there's regulations reining that in, and there's very little of that for cannabis at the moment. The other thing that's a bit distressing is that if you have a psychiatric diagnosis, you're twice as likely to develop cannabis use disorder, and it worsens your outcome for treatment, both for your psychiatric disorder and if you're seeking treatment for cannabis use. And when you look at the reasons people are seeking medical cannabis, anxiety and depression are like within the top three. They're up there. So this is a message that has not reached the public, I fear, because there's no evidence that cannabis is going to help your anxiety or your depression long term. Acutely, you might feel better, but as I say often, a glass of wine at the end of a stressful day makes me feel better, but that's certainly not going to be a medicine. Nobody's going to say that's a medicine for anxiety. So I think that this message has to get out there that this is not helping anxiety and depression, and it's likely worsening things. The other factor impacting the likelihood you develop cannabis use disorder is medical cannabis use. So, and there's a lot of reasons for this. So the therapeutic utility, if you're using cannabis to treat your pain, for example, it's often occurring at concentrations that are intoxicating. 75% of medical cannabis users do so daily. Again, if you have anxiety, if you have pain, you're going to be using it repeatedly throughout the day. And about 25% of this population is estimated to have cannabis use disorder. Cannabis users with chronic pain have higher rates of CUD than those without chronic pain. And there's a recent study showing just obtaining a medical cannabis card. And again, this is just tracking people who wanted this medical cannabis card for, again, pain, anxiety, and depression. And they compared them to a group that delayed their treatment. And the group that got the medical cannabis card had higher rates of cannabis use disorder relative to the delayed treatment group. So as I mentioned, the psychiatric diagnosis increases the likelihood of developing cannabis use disorder, and it worsens your outcome. So over 80% of those using cannabis for medical purposes also use it non-medically. So these are not, these are not two separate groups. They're very, very blurred. But again, those using it for both had higher rates of CUD than those only using it recreationally. So, so again, medical cannabis is a risk factor for CUD, but you don't want to be overly alarming. You really want to look at this in some detail. So you might meet criteria for cannabis use disorder, but are you distressed by it? Or are you simply meeting criteria because you're using it every day as a medicine? So again, if you use something every day, the likelihood of developing tolerance or perhaps craving, or you might meet criteria for some of these symptoms in the DSM. So in a recent meta-analysis, most patients did meet criteria for mild cannabis use disorder. So that's a little bit reassuring, 55 to 80%. So this may be an acceptable risk if it's shown to be efficacious, but this is where we're really at a loss in our society. So yes, we know cannabis has potential and there is evidence for it in treating pain. Yet there's still so much known even about that outcome. So, again, in a meta-analysis, both placebo and active cannabis decreased pain in randomized controlled clinical trials. Again, the expectancy of cannabis working is extremely high, and we know how sensitive pain in particular is to the placebo effect. So we really do need to better understand for these therapeutic potentials how one should use it, what route of administration, what dose, and what type of pain, and so forth. So there's still so much to learn about this, even for things that have a substantial, some substantial evidence. I don't think there's any information ever given to patients that this is a possibility, that this is a side effect that might occur if you're taking cannabis repeatedly throughout the day. Yeah, you could experience withdrawal. And again, cannabis use disorder is not going to kill you, but nobody wants it, and it seems like something that could be, out there for people to be aware of. But again, the medicalization of cannabis is really still largely occurring in a scientific vacuum because the societal changes have far exceeded our ability to collect placebo-controlled evidence. Again, so with medicines, we typically know the bioavailability of different routes of administration, what dose is going to work for a particular indication, what the differing, cannabinoids are going to do, and what ratio one might want. And, what about at-risk populations? Who should and should not take cannabis for medical reasons? So we, of course, need these randomized placebo-controlled trials using a product of known composition. But these are very, very difficult studies to do because the statewide legalized use does not extend to scientific study. As a Schedule I drug, there's an enormous regulatory burden. And that really limits study design because we need large scale studies, and those are very difficult to do with a Schedule I drug. And the FDA is appropriately cautious about what they will let you test. And as you know, both Susan and Eve described, there's not a lot out there that would meet the criteria that the FDA would approve because of these heavy metals, pesticides, inaccurate labeling. I mean, we did a study that I'll describe with just high dose CBD and low dose THC. We had to import it from Canada because there was nothing at the time available that the FDA would approve for us. Um, so, just to hammer this point home again about the importance of placebo control, again, expectation is enormously high. Politicians, media, medical professionals, bud tenders are all telling you cannabis and cannabinoids are medicine. And bud tenders will tell you a lot about what it's going to help you with and what combination you need. And it's all nonsense, obviously, because there's no study. So the vast majority of work out there, because of these difficulties, are observational or comparisons to baseline. But this is informative, but it certainly does not demonstrate efficacy for a medicine. So I just want to give this example of a study that Diana Martinez and I did, an 8-week pilot, and randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial testing the feasibility and tolerability of administering cannabis versus placebo capsules to women with painful taxane-induced peripheral neuropathy. These are women who had breast cancer. They finished their chemotherapy. They had this painful neuropathy, and there's preclinical evidence that cannabidiol and THC are helpful for that. And so we did this study, and our primary endpoint is an 8-week study was a brief pain inventory. It's BPI-5. And so this figure just shows this is over 7 weeks, ratings of the BPI-5 over time, and anything over 4 is clinically significant pain. So you see people come in with pain, and we see this is in the active cannabis condition. We see this nice steady decrease over time. And this is with placebo on top. So if we did not have that placebo group, we'd think we had a great medication. And that's what most of the studies are showing. But look at what, these are women with pain, and look at how that significantly went down over time. And it's not something any of us should be surprised about. It was very disappointing, but it's not much of a surprise. When we looked at the other outcomes, pain interference, sleep, and functional well-being, all of them significantly changed over time, but the only significant effect of cannabis versus placebo was to worsen things. So it actually did worsen sleep. It did worsen functional well-being. So this is a large-scale for-profit industry, and in lieu of placebo-controlled evidence, medical benefit is what marketers say it is. So I do think we will find a variety of therapeutic indications for the constituents or the plant itself, but right now it's largely being dictated by people making money from it. So, again, as scientists, I think that this is an important point to hammer home. So I'm jumping back now to
yeah.
Siva.
Great. So Meg touched on some of the adverse health consequences of cannabis, specifically cannabis use disorder, and thinking about that within the context of people who are using cannabis for medical purposes and weighing the potential risks and benefits. And of course, the benefit would be if the cannabis or cannabinoid preparation is actually effective, well, then you can weigh, the risks and do an analysis that way. And she demonstrated how, the placebo control is absolutely imperative if we actually want to know what the effectiveness is of these types of products. And the question is, we know some of the adverse health consequences. I think that they're still emerging. There's a lot of talk now about cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, something that we didn't even think about, 5 or 10 years ago, but we're seeing it all over the news these days. So the adverse health consequences are known and they're continuing to emerge. And alongside with that are the populations that we think of who might be at heightened risk. And so Meg and Susan talked about people who are using cannabis for medical purposes. We know that older adults, 55 and older, are the fastest growing group of people who are initiating and using cannabis. We know that children and adolescents are at heightened risk for cannabis use and its adverse consequences. And I want to now talk a little bit about women, females, and pregnant women. And so what we're starting to see, thanks, Meg, is that it used to be that being female was protective against using cannabis and in general drugs. But this year, when we looked at the survey trends from Monitoring the Future, it was the first year where women actually showed higher prevalence of both yearly and past month cannabis use relative to the males. And you see this here as a graph depicting trends from 1988 to 2023 in men and women aged 19 to 30. And you can see how there's been a progressive increase in yearly use. And if you look at the same figure, looking at past 30-day use, it's identical. So now women are the prevalence of cannabis use among women is greater than in males. And what's also interesting is I flipped through the figures a little bit to look to see if there was a similar trend with other drugs of abuse and alcohol and tobacco. And it seems like this is really the one drug where the prevalence of use is higher among women than men. So thinking about the implications of this, if you think about pregnant women, and so if you go to the next page, we're starting to see that there are increases of cannabis use among pregnant women. And this was a paper that was published in 2017, some time ago, and it was data that was taken from the Kaiser health system. So the population was, enormous, hundreds of thousands of people. And what the authors found was that there was an increased use of cannabis among pregnant females, specifically among the younger age groups, 18 to 24. There was an updated analysis just this past week that was published, if you go to the next page. And what the authors found, they were the same authors. And what they did was they looked in California. What's nice about California is that there are so many different jurisdictions and different laws that govern cannabis availability. And they compared jurisdictions that had permissive laws related to cannabis availability. So jurisdictions that had dispensaries versus those that banned cannabis dispensaries. And what they found is that over the course of the evolution of increased availability and accessibility of cannabis from 2012 to 2020, what they found was that in general, cannabis use among pregnant women was increasing, but it was dependent on the permissibility or the permissiveness of cannabis availability in those jurisdictions. And so, you can see this nicely here, where after 2018, when recreational cannabis laws were implemented, there was a stark difference between the permissive jurisdictions versus the non-permissive jurisdictions with respect to cannabis use among pregnant women. And so the next question is, what are the implications both to the mother as well as the infant? And so Susan will talk a little bit about that.
So these are extremely challenging studies to do, and there have been a few long-term studies that have followed women and their offspring for many years. But most of those studies were done back in the 70s and 80s when you really had very different types of cannabis and very different patterns of use. But they tended to be fairly similar in that there were effects and they were fairly subtle on cognitive ability as well as on certain types of emotional behavior or psychiatric symptoms. There's a more recent study that's a Gen R study, which is happening in Rotterdam, and that one is actually looking at some of the products that are more recent. Because these are, I think they're now probably in their 20s, I believe, the people who are part of this study. But most of the people in Rotterdam actually use products that contain both tobacco and cannabis. And so there may be some differences there, although the control group there are tobacco only using people. But again, the effects are fairly similar, and they also found certain types of brain changes. So what I'm showing you here is actually retrospective data that we got from the ABCD study. ABCD is the Adolescent Brain and Cognitive Development Study. It's a study of about 12,000 children, and I'll come back to it in a few minutes. But we asked the mothers whether or not they used cannabis during their pregnancy. And what we found was that there were really two groups. One group the majority of them did not report using cannabis. So this is self-report, and that's not always as accurate as one would like, especially among people who were pregnant. Um, but then you had a group that used cannabis before they realized that they were pregnant, and then they stopped. And then you had a group that used continuously throughout their pregnancy. And what you can see here, and what you'll see on the next slide, this is a baseline, is that looking at a variety of different problems, such as externalizing problems, attention problems, thought and social problems, there's a bit of a dose response effect where those who continue to use throughout their pregnancy tended to show a bigger effect. There are, of course, a lot of reasons why this could be. People who continue to use may have had more severe problems, may have had cannabis use disorder. There are many explanations for this, but I think this is something to sort of be paying attention to. And I do want to make the point that these are not gigantic effects. We're talking about a large study where we can detect relatively modest effects. And in fact, that basically is what we're getting. Next slide, please. So the next slide followed them 2 years later. So this is the same group of people, and what you can see is the blue dots are again those women who stopped using once they knew they were pregnant, and the yellow are those who continue to use. And I know you can't read this, but there's a whole bunch of different behaviors that were all affected similarly. So there is this pattern, and this is something that we're hoping to examine in more detail as we go forward with one of our other studies, which I will be telling you about next. Next slide, please. This is the HBCD study, the Healthy Brain and Child Development Study. This is a study that we're just now recruiting. We've got about 3,000 participants recruited. We're recruiting we're recruiting people who are women, people who are pregnant, and we will follow them and their offspring up, hopefully up until about age 10. And again, this is a multi-site. There are 23 sites. It's a longitudinal study, and our goal is to recruit about 7,000 participants, with about a quarter of them being people who use substances during pregnancy. This would include opioids and cannabis and alcohol and tobacco. We're measuring all of these things. The heal part is that there's an interest in sort of the long-term effects of opioid exposure on development. And then there will be another 25% of the population who come from similar environments as those who use substances but who did not use substances. And then the other half of the study will be the sort of diverse cohort of pregnant people that we can recruit at the 23 sites. And you can see this is going to be a very detailed study, and as with the ABCD study, which I'll come back to, we will make the data available from this study as we go along, so people can ask very different questions. But we're hoping we'll be able to have much better indications of what people are actually using, and we're getting biospecimens, so we will have not just self-report, but we'll also have biological confirmation about the use of substances, and hopefully we can get more about doses. So now switching over to adolescents and young adults, this is a fairly old study, but it's actually consistent with other studies that have looked at similar types of outcomes. This was a meta-analysis it was bringing together several different studies in New Zealand and Australia, looking at odds ratios of a variety of different outcomes among people who were age 30 at the time of the study, but who had used cannabis before age 17. And what you can see, and what I think is compelling about it, is this dose response type of effect. And you can see that the adjusted odds ratio, obviously for cannabis use disorder, are going to be much higher in people who use daily, for other illicit drug use as well. And I do want to point out suicide attempt, because I'm going to come back to that. And this is something that has come out now in a variety of studies, and it's not completely clear why cannabis has been associated with increased risk for suicide, but and it's not always associated with depression, but it does seem to be a factor in suicidal ideation and suicide attempts. And again, as with many studies, the degree of high school completion or of college degree attainment tends to go down with people who are using more frequently. In this particular study, there was not a change in rates of depression, although some other studies have found that welfare dependence and other measures of lifetime achievement tend to also go with the daily use. So one of the reasons that one of the reasons that we were interested in starting our ABCD study, actually, can I have not quite ready for it yet. One of the reasons that we were interested in our ABCD study is because we see these kinds of effects, but we don't really know what causes somebody to be using it frequently when they're young. We don't know if there are other risk factors that they have, if there are family problems, if there are genetic factors. And so we need to understand whether it's cannabis exposure itself that's leading to a lot of these outcomes, or whether it's some combination with some other factors that may also be predisposing to some of these negative outcomes. Next slide, please. This is really just what Meg was saying already, that among people who are young, the chances of developing a substance use disorder are greater than in somebody who starts in adulthood. And this is, again, coming back to the other point that Meg was making, that people just don't think of cannabis as being an addictive substance. And in fact, if you look among people who are young and you look at how long they've been using cannabis, you can see that the prevalence of cannabis use disorder among 12 to 17-year-olds is higher even than you see for cigarettes and alcohol. So it really is a problem that that somehow or other we really need to convey better to the public. It's very hard when there's so many people that are using it without having negative outcomes, and yet we know that for some people it can be quite negative. Next slide, please. So this is one of the other very important issues of concern, which has to do with the likelihood of developing a psychotic disorder, or of developing it earlier, or of developing a more serious form. This is one of many studies that have looked at the incidence of psychosis. This is done in several different countries in Europe, and looking at a combined marker of both frequency of use, daily use, and potency. And in this case, they considered high potency greater than 10%, which, as we know, is actually quite low for the kind of potency that many people in the U.S. are getting exposed to. But again, you can see a sort of dose response curve on the incidence of psychosis in these different countries. I will say that there are a number of population level studies that support this, but there's still some arguments about it, and there are some case control studies that show that patients with a high clinical risk don't necessarily show an impact of cannabis. But at this point, I think the data are strong enough to recommend that somebody who has a history of psychosis in their family be very careful, and in fact shouldn't use cannabis at all. We need to understand better who is most vulnerable. We know that not everybody that uses cannabis develops a psychosis, but we also know that that it can cause an acute psychosis, particularly when somebody's exposed to higher doses. Next slide, please. And this is another slide. This is coming back to the suicidal ideation and attempts. And this was a study that was also done using data from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. And it was looking at people that had cannabis use disorder, people that use cannabis daily. It was actually a comparison also between males and females. But it also looked at those who did and who did not report major depressive disorder. And obviously the risks of suicidal ideation or suicidal attempts was greater in those who had a major depressive disorder, but cannabis use disorder seemed to exacerbate that difference. And the same thing even in people who did not report an episode of major depressive symptoms. So there's something there, and it's not totally clear what it is, but it's certainly a warning. And I think, what I've heard from people, and this is more anecdote, but it's people who have lost their family members to suicide. It often seems to be associated with these very, very high dose products, dabbing, and very high potency products, and psychosis. And so there's probably, or there may be, a relationship there, that some of the suicidal ideation and attempts may be related to some of the psychosis inducing effects that cannabis can have. Next slide, please. So this is the ABCD study, which I hope most of you have heard of. I hope most of you are using the data from ABCD. We've been doing this now since 2016. This is a study of adolescents. And again, part of the rationale for this study in the first place was the fact that we knew that the cannabis laws were changing. We were very worried about a large increase in use by young people. We haven't seen that so much. And we were trying to disentangle the factors that we know are associated with some of the negative outcomes associated with cannabis use or with frequent cannabis use, particularly among young people, and to really get a sense of what they were like before this happened. So we started with youth. We started with almost 12,000 kids who were ages 9 and 10 when they started. They're now turning 18. And again, we have a whole range of different types of assessments that we've done. We also have links to outside data sources, and we have geocoding. There's a lot of data that are available. These are available to the wide research community, and we continue to do data releases on a yearly or almost yearly basis because we really want people to be asking all sorts of questions with these data, many that we never even anticipated when we began this study. Next slide, please. So in summary, what we know, what we're learning, we know that there are certain risks during intoxication. We know that particularly exposure to very high doses can lead to a psychosis and paranoia, which usually dissipates as the drug effects wear off. There can be cardiovascular events. We know that it's associated with increased risk for driving accidents, particularly when combined with alcohol. With high potency products, there may be adverse reactions, particularly in people who are relatively naive, or there are those who have been exposed accidentally. We do think these contribute to psychosis risk, and we really still don't know enough about the acute and long-term effects. And these are very hard to study because of the federal and state laws making it difficult to do the research on top of the Schedule 1 aspects of doing work with cannabis in general. Next slide, please. So the risk of chronic use, and at this point, we think many of those, those most vulnerable may be those exposed prenatally or during adolescence, but there may be other vulnerable groups. And actually, we know there are other vulnerable groups, including those with mental health conditions or mental health vulnerabilities. But cannabis use disorder and other substance use disorders, mental illness, and particularly, again, as I mentioned, psychosis and suicidal ideation. And for prenatal exposure, there's been some discrepancies in the findings of people that have been looking at this in recent years, but in general, low birth weight is quite consistent. There's often a greater risk of NICU involvement, and there do seem to be, can you go back or go forward?
Sorry.
That's okay. There do seem to be modest effects on brain development and behavioral outcomes, and this is what we're seeing from the ABCD study, and this is what we saw in some of those earlier longitudinal studies that were following people, and hopefully we'll learn more from the HBCD study. There's very little known about certain populations. As Ziva said, older adults are among the fastest growing users of cannabis products, some for medical purposes, some perhaps not. And pregnant women, we know that the numbers have been going up. They went up during COVID, and and many pregnant women continue to see this as a natural product that there's no risk for, although the associations for obstetrics and and gynecology all recommend against cannabis use during pregnancy. We know that there are ED visits, and some of these are accidental, but a lot of these have to do with this cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, which we really didn't know much about at all, 10, 15 years ago, but it's this very severe vomiting and stomach pain syndrome that people tend to take showers for, and we use antipsychotics to treat it, but really the only way to treat it is to stop using cannabis. And then there are these semi-synthetic, and then there are the, 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 and then there, and then there are the, 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 and then. Okay, thank you, whoever turned it off. So we have these semi-synthetic cannabinoids that Ziva talked about, many derived from hemp and derived from CBD, which can be derived from hemp. There are perioperative considerations, and then there's all of this information that Ziva presented about what we don't know about product integrity and contaminants in the products that are being sold and that are really widely available. Next slide, please. So the bottom line so far is that the risks to some can be very serious. The perceptions of harm are universally down, even among those who are potentially vulnerable populations. The patterns of use are changing dramatically, and that's likely resulting in consumption of much larger amounts of THC. The increases in product variety will continue to sustain the market, especially when the costs of manufacturing have plummeted. There are likely going to be more unanticipated harms that will emerge with chronic use, especially with high THC exposure. The intoxicating hemp products are rapidly emerging, particularly in states that have no legal markets. They're widely available, unregulated, and with unknown health effects. And while use among adolescents has not increased, use in young and older adults has increased substantially. And actually, there are a couple of reports that there are increases in cannabis use disorder in adolescents, which may have to do with the patterns of use, of how they're using. And as you saw from again what Ziva presented, the states that have or counties that have more liberal laws continue to be above the national average on most measures. Increased access is certainly associated with increased use. Regulations matter, and they can help mitigate potential harms. Right now, we're in a pretty much free commercialization state in the U.S. That's not the way it is in parts of Canada, and you can do certain things to mitigate some of the potential public health effects. And we need to have strong public health campaigns in place before the laws change, and they need to be credible. Especially as a government person, I can say we're not often believed when we warn about the harms of cannabis. But we're still really in a very early stage, and especially related to these high potency products and big cannabis, et cetera. And I'm going to turn it back to Ziva, who can talk about the most recent NASEM report, which just got released.
Great. I'm also just going to check on. Oh, how come there's an echo there? Am I still echoing? Good. Check on time. Caroline, we're going to 2:30
Yes. Yeah.
for
So
Sandy. Yeah.
I
Okay,
would leave
great.
some time for questions. So
Okay, so I'll just talk briefly about the 2024 NASEM report that was just published at the end of September that was supported by the CDC and the NIH. So NIDA really helped to support this report. And those of you who know the 2017 report, which was a great resource related to what the health consequences of cannabis are. It includes therapeutic potential as well as adverse effects. This one was quite different. The committee was really tasked to think about the public policy related to cannabis and how it might impact outcomes overall. And for this, given the fact that we have a patchwork of regulations across the United States, we talked about just the availability of cannabis and cannabinoid products in the United States and the regulatory frameworks of the cannabis industry in the United States. And we also talked about other models internationally. And we were also asked to think about what are the strengths and the weaknesses of our health surveillance system and recommend harm reduction approaches to cannabis policy and set a policy research agenda for the next 5 years. So we were not asked to comprehensively review the material related to the health consequences of cannabis or speak about legalization or rescheduling or prohibition. So you can follow the QR code down below if you're interested in getting the full report for free. And so if you go to the next slide, I'll highlight the recommendations that we made. So the first recommendation really goes back to that issue with the semi-synthetic cannabinoids that have been allowed because of the Farm Bill, which permits the use of hemp, the manufacturing of hemp products, and now we are seeing a proliferation of the semi-synthetic cannabinoids. And so the first recommendation was really tasking Congress to refine the definition of hemp and be able to remove those loopholes that exist that are contributing to these novel products that we're seeing, many of which we have no idea what the effects are. So you go to the next recommendation. The next recommendation was really tasking the CDC and other federal agencies to conduct research to understand what are some of the best practices to protect the public health as we're seeing increased availability and accessibility of cannabis across the United States. And some of that research can be done by looking at other countries or jurisdiction-specific practices, for example, those that exist in California, and looking at different outcomes based off of those types of policies that have been implemented. And the next recommendation goes back to this idea of product integrity and protecting the consumer. And so right now, there are no standards that these states are uniformly adhering to. But the USP, the United States Pharmacopoeia, does set forth standards for the cannabis plant material, for example, that we study in the laboratory. And so the idea is that for the USP to develop standards and for the state regulators to adopt those standards and enforce them. And that's a tall, that's going to be a big task, but we think that this will really help to protect consumers. And if you go to the next one, the next one is to touch on what Meg was talking about, how when you go into a dispensary and you talk to a bud tender, they don't necessarily have the best information or evidence-based information to provide the consumer. So we also recommended that these bud tenders and clinicians be trained and actually certified with some type of educational material so that the consumer can be protected. If you go to the next one. The next recommendation was touching on what Susan talked about before, which was that, we know that people are using these different products, the products are available, but we don't have really great data about the types of cannabis products that people are using at the population level. So now we're starting to see surveys here and there where patients are being probed or participants are being probed about the type of product. We're asking them about what's on the label of that product. But at a national level, there's really a gap here, with respect to intensity of use. So we're starting to see that national surveys are including frequency of use from yearly, past 30 days, weekly, all the way down to daily. But as Susan touched on, what about the frequency or the intensity of that use, let's say in a given day? And you can imagine that somebody who's using daily, just 1 puff a day, the health outcomes related to their cannabis use is probably going to be quite different when you look at that person compared to somebody who's smoking, 10 pre-rolled cannabis cigarettes a day. So we really urged the CDC and other organizations to be able to improve surveillance. And if you go to the next recommendation, is related to social equity programs and to evaluate criminal justice policies, and also implement automatic expungement for low-level cannabis crimes. And for the next one, I think this is the last one. The last one is for you, Susan, and everybody at NIH, to really dedicate resources to be able to study the impact of these policies and the complexities of these policies and the health outcomes. And only with that type of research will we have protection of public health as we see increased access and emerging products continue. And with that, I think we'd like to thank you all as an audience and hand it over to Jeff.
Thank you all.
Sorry, just before you start, Jeff, I just wanted to take a second to acknowledge that this seminar is supported by Chosen. It's the Center for Healing Opioid and Other Substance Use Disorders. It's a university-wide organization that's based in Columbia University, and the departments that are most involved are the School of Social Work, the Department of Psychiatry Division on Substance Use Disorders, and the Irving Institute for Clinical and Translational Research. So I just wanted to thank Chosen for helping support this seminar, and thank you guys for your amazing talks. That was really incredible. So Jeff, you want to go ahead?
Thank you, and I'll be very brief. I want to get out of the way so whoever has questions can ask questions. I'm not going to summarize what everybody just said. That tremendous presentation. For a regular person, for a regular policy person, messy and complicated are the two words that keep popping into my head, not because things are bad, but because it's messy and complicated. We know a lot, we don't know a lot. It's messy and complicated. We would all like to believe that policy decisions are going to be made based on science. If you've been paying attention to the world in your entire life, you know that that is much more often not true than true. And we find ourselves at a point in policy and political history where that might become less true. I'm sorry to say. It hasn't been, things have been variable over um, several the past several years. And even given all of this, we have a large majority of Americans who feel pretty strongly that some version of marijuana or cannabis legalization should happen. Call it what people will, understand it well, don't understand it well, but large majorities of Americans want cannabis products to be legal and available. We also know, assuming you've all been paying attention for the past several months, that there is a policy move to downschedule cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. I won't take up your time here going through the 1,001 complex issues around that. My head seems to explode on a regular basis on that. The process is happening slowly. Whether the process actually happens and rescheduling happens, if anybody claims they know, they are lying to you because we really do not know. And this is also, I would argue, going to be more rather than less complicated by what has happened just in the last couple of weeks politically. We have a president-elect who at least has said that he would like to see some version of marijuana legalization. We have a incoming Senate majority leader who has spent his entire career speaking against marijuana reform. We have the chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Health Subcommittee who has been equally against marijuana reform. We have at least if you've been looking at your phone while we've been on here for the last hour and a half, our Robert F. Kennedy is going to be the nominee for HHS secretary. He's very pro legalization. He's also, I would argue, very anti-science. So I don't know what to make of that. You have different states, even in the last couple of weeks, who have passed some marijuana liberalization laws. You have a couple or three, including Florida, even though a majority of Florida residents voted in favor of legalization. They didn't pass the threshold that they needed. And so Florida will not, at least for now, legalize cannabis. So messy with a capital M, complicated with a capital C, not always for good reasons, but there don't have to be good reasons for things to be messy and complicated. I would like to believe that someday we could actually base what we do on what we know. But sadly, my cynicism seems to get validated on a regular basis. And this issue is no different than others in that regard. We know so much more from science about health effects of cannabis than we have over the years, and there's a long way to go. And Susan, I hope you're going to continue to get the funding that you need to keep answering some of these questions. I'll stop there. That's enough from me, Sandy.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else have questions they want to ask Dr. Abasal? You're on mute.
Thank you all for great presentations and very thoughtful science, and I truly appreciate it. And I have specific questions around the healthy brain in terms of who you are reaching, Susan, in this study. And in your presentation, you talked a little bit about the more structural issue and regulatory issues that may impact the outcomes that you're looking at. And I wonder, in this new healthy brain, in your design, are you looking at structural issues? Are you looking at equity issues beyond regulatory issues? And that would be a great opportunity, because in all the presentations that are wonderful presentation, informative, scientifically sound, the issue of the context and structural issues have not been addressed in the presentations.
Yeah, I think that's something that we're very, very interested in, and I'm going to guess that given the most recent results, that this is going to become even more important. But we are very interested in the structural factors that, and it's going to affect our participation and our retention, and we've had in order to do that study and to recruit women who are using substances during pregnancy, we've had to really think a lot about how do we not harm them from being in the study? And that, we have a site in Alabama, and there's mandatory reporting there, and we've gone to sort of great lengths in order not to have the people at the site know who were using the substances, and so they don't have to do reporting. So all of these factors, I mean, we have a lot of people that have both legal experience and ethical experience, but we're in a number of different places, and we're very interested in the structural factors. And actually, that's turned out to be one of the important things from ABCD that we weren't even thinking about when we started, but we were collecting a lot of information about the environment itself and where people are living and their neighborhoods. And we have, again, geocoded data, and we can link to other kinds of data. And that's turned out to lead to a number of different papers that are really starting to give us an idea of the complexity of the factors that are affecting outcomes. And for HBCD, I think that's going to be even more important. So I appreciate what you're saying, and we are definitely very attentive to that.
Thank you.
Okay, we have some questions coming through in the chat. One by Paula, which Meg answered in the chat, so I'll let you guys read that response. And then Alexis Marshall asked, do you think the recent trend of women using cannabis more than men could have anything to do with what medical cannabis can be recommended for? I've seen a few papers claiming pain relief for dysmenorrhea, endometriosis, and chronic pelvic floor pain. I don't know who wants to take that question.
Happy to take that. So there are products that are specifically geared towards some of these women's health issues. We're starting to see ones that are popping up for, perimenopause as well. And also, the number one indication for which people are using medical cannabis is chronic pain. And we know that there are certain pain conditions that are more prevalent among women, for example, fibromyalgia. So that might be part of it. Another part of it might be just that there's now, reduced stigma related to using cannabis, especially now that people are using it for medical purposes. So maybe that's why we're seeing more women use it. And, there's a potential biological basis reason for maybe why more women are using cannabis. They might be more sensitive to the potential analgesic effects and some other effects relative to men. So there's a whole number of variables there that are probably going into why we're starting to see this shift.
Great, thanks. I have a question for you, Ziva. So in the recommendations that NASEM made about policies surrounding cannabis, use, do you think that there are any lessons to be learned from alcohol or tobacco regulation? I mean, cannabis is so different because it does potentially have therapeutic uses. And from that perspective, is it better to look at opioids, but it doesn't have the same toxicity as opiates? So I'm just kind of wondering how you thought about that when you guys wrote the report.
Yeah, Sandy, it is really gray because of the medical and adult use markets, which again, even though, Meg pointed out that there is a significant part of the population who are using both, they're, potentially very different products, different populations who are using it, different ways they're using it. And so we did look at tobacco and alcohol structures. But we also, I think there was more information gleaned from other countries that have used different models. For example, in Canada, where it's fully legal, medical and adult use is fully legal. And also in Canada, there's different jurisdictions that are more prohibitive and less prohibitive. For example, Quebec is more prohibitive or more conservative with respect to the types of products that can be sold. For example, edibles cannot be sweet. They have THC infused cauliflower instead of gummies there, right? So they have a very different model there, and they have a potency cap, for example. And so there's been enough years that have elapsed where you can actually look to see differences in outcomes with respect to, use, frequency of use, outcomes, looking at hospital records and that type of thing, as well as other countries. For example, Uruguay, which also has a very interesting structure for legalization, and they have a way of who can manufacture, who can sell, where you can consume. So we looked a lot at those data quite a bit. And it's interesting. There's all different types of policies that the US isn't necessarily embracing in the same way, simply because I think because there's economic drivers, of course. And also there just isn't the oversight. There's no federal oversight. The enforcement is lacking in general at the state level. So things are kind of, going off the rails a little bit.
And there are the,
At least
and then there are the, 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 and then
there's
there are
Meg's
the, and
little
then there are
echo.
the, and then
Yeah,
there are
Meg,
the, and then there are the, and then there are
shoot,
the,
why
and
am
then there
I
are the,
echoing
and then there are the, and
again?
then
But
I think you have to mute yourself and then Meg will be okay.
okay, okay, there you go. I'm muting myself. Meg,
and
talk
then
about
there
what's
are the,
happening
and
in
then
New
there are
York
the,
with
and
all
then
the
there are
bodega.
the, and then there are the, and then there are the, and then there are the, and then
Nabila, maybe you have to mute too.
there are the, and then 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 there are
We're
the,
not
and then
hearing anything but your echo, Meg.
Shoot, I don't know why that's doing that.
That's very bizarre.
Sorry, shoot. Does anybody else have another question? Because I have one actually for Jeff and Ed, but I want to give other people an opportunity to ask a question. No, okay. So Ed and Jeff, I guess, you guys have been in policy for so long. Given what Ziva said about, what NASEM has the approach that they've taken, what do you think is the most reasonable sort of policy approaches that can be taken given today's climate, to curb some of these problems associated with cannabis use?
Jeff, I'll defer to you. Why don't you start and I'll follow up.
It's a very reasonable question that should have a straightforward answer, and I don't think there is a straightforward answer. A couple of initial thoughts. I think as scientists and science advocates, we need to continue what we have been doing to not only in effect publicize the work that you are all continuing to do, but to work with the scientific societies and others to get that information out into the political world. I know that my pessimism, frankly, about I'm concerned about funding. I'm concerned about how much the new administration and the new makeup of the Congress will care, frankly, about paying any attention to what science says. I'm quite concerned about that, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing that kind of advocacy and discussion, but I'm concerned about how successful. I mean, it's even on your best day, it's hard to be successful at that, right? It just is. It's difficult. I think the waters are choppier now than they have been in quite some time. And it's confusing to me because looking at the array of folks who will more likely than not be decision makers, they don't agree with each other to the degree that we know, they don't agree with each other on cannabis issues already. And so that could, you could go both ways on that. I could be Mr. Negative and say, well, it's just a damn mess. I'm going to throw my arms up and walk away. But that also gives us an opportunity to potentially fill an information void with what we know. And, the strength and benefit of reports like the new NASEM report is that, here, the government spent a bunch of money. Here are independent scientists saying, here's what we know. Based on what we know, we think we think you guys should either do this or try that. And I think there is always value in that. So that doesn't completely answer your question, but it's more of a, my head is still in a process place, I guess, and I'm sure Ed has more to add to that.
Well, Sandy, I think the first thing, first off, thank you everyone for such great presentations, very informative, and I would also say very discerning of the troubling is if I take from it, from what I hear in terms of the impact. One of the things that I think should be done is liberalizing or streamlining DEA regulate licensing requirements, so Schedule 1 compounds, whether it's decriminalize up, downward scheduled or not, there needs to be more research on the issue of cannabis, both the claims of its potential benefits and its harm. The second, which is it does seem like a trend that the more states that legalize or liberalize use of cannabis gives the impression that cannabis must be safe, which results in increased usage, particularly as it impacts pregnant women. Lastly, I keep coming in my mind, and whether this is real or not, maybe the FDA should be regulating cannabis as a pharmaceutical, subject to pre-market approval. Claims should be tested, which of course I think is a very ideal sense, but there's a lot of product on the market that's adulterated, that is confusing potency, and that can only be, we have the experience of dietary supplements where it's subject to post-market surveillance, not pre-market approval, where there's a lot of adulteration in the vitamins that we're getting on the market, that the only way to fix it is subject to pre-market approval under FDA regulation. I don't know if that's possible, but I am concerned about the product, not just the claims that are being made, but the product that's being sold. And given the other impact is with the greater commercialization, the more money that's invested, the sales will be out of control because that's going to control the politics and discussion around cannabis.
That was what I was going to say. I don't think we can discount the role of industry. It's huge. And I think it's very influential. And even I can tell you with respect to the hemp industry, I don't know how much, that trying to modify the Farm Bill and trying to tighten up some of those loopholes, there's a whole industry out there fighting it. And this is, so I think that that's not a minor component of what has to happen and what is also part of, what is also going to be influencing how all of this plays out. And if the FDA tries to regulate it like the Center for Tobacco Products, every time they tried to do something, they were sued by the tobacco industry. It was an extremely slow and difficult process. I think it is very complex, and I think we would all there's clearly ways to do better with respect to public health. I mean, having better oversight, having federal involvement in regulating what the products are, and making sure that there are certain things that are safe about it. But I'm also with Jeff in being kind of skeptical and pessimistic given what I've seen, and that's apart from wherever we are politically now.
Yeah, in some ways the genie is out of the bottle. And some of that's created by DEA by restricting the research on cannabis, creating a vacuum, allowing for extravagant, unproven claims to be made. And I'm not naive to assume that FDA is going to be able to regulate it. I'm just saying, in an ideal world, maybe that's what should happen.
All right. So thanks everyone for the amazing talks and the thoughtful discussion. I really appreciate everyone's participation, and thanks everyone for sticking around. So I will see you all in another.
Thank you all.
So good to see everybody. Thank you for the invitation.